This is Dolores Cannon, and welcome again to the Metaphysical Hour. And we're going to be on for another hour tonight, and we have another special guest. But first, before we start, I want to give out the number. This is a toll-free number that anyone in the world can call. It's 877-876-5227. 877-876-5227. And that's toll-free all over the world if anyone wants to call in and ask our guests questions while we're on the air. All right. Tonight, my guest is Justine Alessi, and she's one of the authors that my company has published. And she is a publisher's dream.
Thank you.
Because she has gone out and promoted her books and been doing lectures and book signings. And she's willing to do anything we ask her. And if there are any publishers out there, they know this is the kind of an author you really want to have on board.
That is so kind. Thank you, Dolores.
Okay. But Justine is a tarot reader, but it's not just any tarot reader. I consider her a master at her art. And her book that she wrote that we published is called The Rebirth of the Oracle. And it's bringing the tarot into the modern world. Because as everyone knows, the tarot has been around for thousands of years, but most of the definitions refer to the olden times. Now, she has rewritten and brought it up to the modern times. And Justine, didn't you say you worked on this for about 30 years?
20, almost 20 years, yeah, until I finally wrote it all down. What I had done is it was a hobby, and I was a librarian prior to being a tarot reader, and it was a hobby, and I started to notice things, and it was like a gift that was given to me, and I thought, somebody has to write this down, and a little voice in my head kept saying, it better be you, because nobody else is going to, so I did, and I actually brought the meetings into the 21st century, because some of the older tarot books would have a card like the Seven of Wands, for instance, and it would say Civil War. Well, that doesn't apply to today. You know, we're not in Civil War. So I made it more meaningful. What I brought it up into is like not war, but conflict among a select small group, like a workplace or something like that, rather than Civil War. Also including alternative lifestyles, internet dating, because we had to have cards for them. So I started to notice the cards when people were asking me specific questions, and I thought, well, that'll make sense. And it does. It's been very well received.
So you have just kind of come across this by yourself?
Absolutely. All the work in Rebirth of the Oracle, all of the definition is mine. It's from doing thousands of card readings, and I started to notice patterns, not only in the people cards, which you know, Dolores, are my biggest focus, but in the minor arcana, which are the cards of day-to-day living, I noticed patterns, and I thought, okay, if that keeps appearing when somebody's asking me, how am I going to meet somebody, which will be the Eight of Wands, I have, you direct introduction by a friend in the workplace. When I see the Eight of Wands, that's got to be internet romance, because it's arrows of love through the air. Does that make sense?
Oh, okay, yeah, I see the connection there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, before we get into more of that, do you want to tell the people listening about yourself, about your own history?
Well, it's not very exciting, really. I was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 1949. My parents were Anthony and Justine Alessi, and I grew up in the suburb, well, first in the city and then in the suburb with my three sisters, Jeannie, Janet, and Joanne. Typical growing up in the 50s kind of childhood, and I married young to my husband, Robert. Bob's 68 now, and I'm 57, and we've been married for 37 years. And I have two children and one grandchild.
Uh-huh.
And I'm a mom, a grandma. We've lived in the same house. We live in Ohio. We've lived in the same house for 30 years. We're kind of the normal American family, There's nothing very exciting about us.
But they always say, what is normal anyway?
Yeah, well, I guess as normal as you could be, huh?
But you started out just doing the tarot as a hobby?
Well, what happened was I was a librarian, and I live in a little town. It's about 60 miles outside of Cleveland. It's called North Kingsville. And there's a public library here. And I worked in there since my daughter will be 34 this week, and she was 1.5, so whatever that would be, almost 33 years.
Yeah.
And I worked there, and I also worked in another library a longer time. But when she was young, I started to work part-time. And one day, probably it was in the 1980, I believe it was 84, a young man who came in the library, he had a kind of a difficult upbringing, and he took to hanging out in libraries, you know, a lot of kids will do that, and I always felt sorry for him because he didn't have any shoes on. I mean, he had shoes, but his feet were all cramped, and he used to tell me his feet hurt. So going against every, I suppose, rule in the world, I bought him a pair of shoes. I felt sorry for him. And he kind of clung on to me after that for a while, and he brought me my first deck of cards, and he laid them on my desk, and he said, "You can do these."
Oh, you hadn't seen them before that?
Never. And so, I kind of, you know, had heard of them, but, you know, I grew up in the 60s, but no, I wasn't real big into anything metaphysical. I was just your normal Italian Catholic girl, you know.
Okay.
And working in, you know, the steady job and going home when my kids were home and work part-time, the husband worked. Like I say, the typical family. Well,
yeah, I've been there on that, so we've all been through that part.
Yes. And so I just, you know, he gave me the cards, and I was like, I know what these are. And it was a familiarity, I should say, more than a knowledge. I just felt what they are. And I could read them. I don't know why, but I could read them. And to the place where it was almost a little bit of frightening to me at the time. I was in my late 30s, and I was like, wow, how come I know this?
Because you hadn't had any classes or anything.
Nothing. What happened today is he brought him one of the mothers. I was doing a story time group, and one of the mothers came in. Her name was Cheryl Gray, and she had twins, little kids. And she said, She said, "Oh, tarot cards." And I said, "Yeah." I said, "Do you know anything about them?" She goes, "Sure. Let me show you how to lay them out."
Oh, okay.
And she said to me, she said, "There's a book called The Tarot of the Bohemians," which at the time may well have been one of the few tarot books in existence. And I got it, and I read that, and that was the only book I ever read. And she told me, she showed me, we were sitting in her kitchen one day, she said, "Just they'll talk to you, just let them talk." She was a Native American Indian. Yeah. And it was true, and they talk. They absolutely, I don't mean, you know, Dolores, it's not like I have voices in my head, but they really, thoughts roll out of the cards into my mind. And they're seldom wrong, but they're seldom, if ever, wrong. Tarot today has to be, my goal is actually to bring the tarot back to what it was originally meant to be, which is a tool of enlightenment. My goal is to erase the stigma of the charlatanism and the carnival atmosphere. To be
sorry, and all of that, you know.
Well, yeah, I want to tell people, you know, there's so many people out there who have destroyed what I consider a beautiful tool of enlightenment. It is. It can tell you anything you want to know. All you have to do is ask it, and it appeals to the subconscious. And over the years, you know, I'm sure, I mean, I live in a small town, and we've got people who get arrested with bunco because they tell people, you know, if they buy this rock that they picked up on Lake Erie, because it's where I live, it'll change their life. Well, that's not what a tarot reader does. You have to understand, and you have to be very compassionate.
Yeah, we get those things in the mail all the time, you know.
Right.
To be lucky stuff if you send something back in. Of course, they always want money.
Right, and that's not what tarot is about. Tarot, actually, to read cards, what the tarot will do, it will tell you the way your life is going to go in any given situation if you just leave it alone. However, realizing the tarot is based on the tree of life, you may be at a place on the tree of life that you don't want to be. You have absolute power to change it because the strongest force in the universe is free will. So if you're in a place, say, I get a lot of relationship questions, and I'll have people who repeatedly are in negative relationships or won't get out of them. And my journey is not to tell them to get out of their relationship, but rather to say, if you stay in this relationship, this is what will happen. However, if you leave it, this is what will happen. They have to pick. You, as a reader, you cannot choose for people.
Yeah. But that's one thing, I know, too. I know something about the tarot, but I also know you're not supposed to read a lot of negativity either.
Oh, absolutely not. One of the first things when I teach tarot classes, I say that everything's in the delivery, everything. And if you look at Rebirth of the Oracle, especially like people are, they worry about card readings. And the first time I do anybody's cards, I sort of have like a canned speech. But I want them to feel comfortable. And what I say is the first time I do anybody's cards, I like to explain them. These are tarot cards. You will control this reading by asking questions. When you say you will control the reading, they're immediately put at ease because I'm not going to jump out and say something awful. If you ask me, I'll tell you the truth. I will always tell you the truth. But if you don't want to talk about whatever it is, I'm not going to talk about it. And then you say, these cards will tell you the way your life is going to go in any given situation if you leave it alone. However, you can always change things. The tarot will give you the path. You can ask me anything you like about yourself and those closest to you regarding love, health, work, money, career, travel, anything at all. At that point, I pull out the two cards that frighten people. One is death and one is the devil.
Yeah,
I'm not God. I don't know who's going to die, and neither is anybody else. And I tell my clients, if you encounter a reader who says you're going to die, get up and walk out for two reasons. One, they are assuming the power of God, and that isn't who they are. And secondly, they don't know anything about the tarot. What the death card really is an event. And it's an event that has such a strong energy to it that it will change the four energies of life that are defined by the tarot, which are your day-to-day activities, your finances, your personal relationships, and your empowerment. Therefore, marriage, divorce, having kids when they grow up, moving across the country, changing careers. If you won the Mega Millions tonight, it would be a death card. That's what it is. It's nothing else. It will change everything.
Well, the way I was taught to read the tarot, too, is that the death card means the death of a situation.
Right, because you're going for, and it's a big situation. I always tell people, like, if you're a nurse at Hospital A and go to be a nurse at Hospital B, that's not a death card. However, if you're a nurse at Hospital A and decide you're going to go to the police academy and become a detective, that's a death card. Because that's that big of a change.
Yeah, and a lot of people have things in their life, their situations, and it's the death of a situation and the rebirth of something totally new.
Something new, something like that begins again.
Uh-huh.
And the other one's the devil. A lot of fundamentalists will say things like, oh, you're evil, the tarot's evil. Well, I'm not evil, and neither is the tarot. It's the devil card that it is. What happened to the best of my ability to study the tarot, because, all of it was so lost. The belief is that the cards made their way into Europe during the Renaissance. Well, in Italy and France, they didn't have a word to translate the hieroglyphic of death and the devil. They did the best they could. Now in English we have the word for the death card, which would be transformation, and for the devil, which would be bondage. The devil,
bondage, okay.
Bondage. We're bound to. The devil is what we do to ourselves. We are self-imposed bondage. What we do to ourselves to prevent our own growth. I know I'm old enough, and, probably many listeners out there are old enough to remember somebody saying, oh, he or she is battling his or her own demons. Well, you remember that saying?
Yeah,
And it's basically what the devil card is. And what I found in all my research in writing Rebirth of the Oracle, that 90% of people's devil card is anxiety and fear. Anxiety and fear holds more people back from becoming what they could